2 years ago, we said we would never send tanks. We did. 2 years ago, we said we would never send medium-range missiles. We did. Those who say, let's not support Ukraine, do not make the choice of peace. They make the choice of defeat. Above all, French President Emmanuel Macron said, our objective is to make sure that Russia does not win. As Avdiivka fell in February 2024, whispers of a critical turning point began to stir, suggesting more than just a tactical shift in the war in Ukraine. Amid Ukraine's faltering counteroffensive and the dire scarcity of ammunition and weapons, the West faced a daunting prospect. Could Russia emerge victorious, reducing Ukraine to a shadow of itself, or worse, annexing it entirely? Macron's stark warnings underscored the gravity of the situation, hinting at the potential need for Western boots on the ground. For Europe, the implications of a Russian victory stretch far beyond the battlefield, challenging its security, its standing on the global stage, and its integrity. In this video, we'll uncover the complex web of political, geopolitical, economic, and ideological reasons that render Russia's outright victory a scenario Europe cannot afford. But to see why a Russian victory would prove so threatening to Europe, we must first take a look at the continent's geography and the strategic and political realities that it demands. President Macron was far less accommodating in response to the developments in early 2024 for a good reason. The previous scenario, which envisioned Russia holding a small portion of eastern Ukraine, was far from a great power standpoint, something that the West could accept. Such a small territorial gain would go internationally unrecognized indefinitely. It would also do little to improve Russia's geostrategic position. One of Russia's traditional geopolitical goals, stretching back to the time it threw off Mongol rule, is to create a frontier with strong natural defenses. Unfortunately for Moscow, Russia's geography makes this a difficult goal to achieve. In Europe, Russian territory comes at the widest points of the European plain, a land feature starting with the Bay of Biscay in the west and ending with the Ural Mountains in the east. The further east you go, the broader the plain gets. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a geostrategic disaster for Russia, erasing centuries of gains. The new post-Soviet border was thousands of miles long, stretching from the Arctic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This broad open area has no natural fortifications, and it meant that Russia would be hard-pressed to defend its territory in the event of a conflict with NATO. Relating to the European plain is Russia's strong desire to create a buffer for the Volgograd Gap. This narrow area straddling Russian territory between the Black and Caspian Seas is the connection of the European-Russian heartland to the Caucasus and those two bodies of water. A severing of this line would cut that connection off. This area was a target for the German invasions of Russia in both of the world wars, a memory that the Kremlin has not forgotten. It's no coincidence that Putin resorted to reducing the city of Grozny to rubble in the battle that raged there between 1999 and early 2000. It could not tolerate anything that undermined its control of this vital area. Russia's campaign in Ukraine has so far proven unsatisfactory in Moscow's attempts to acquire more defensible frontiers and to increase the buffer to protect the Volgograd Gap. It has only advanced a few hundred kilometers to the west at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties, material losses that will take decades to replace, and the most robust set of economic sanctions ever imposed on a country. Such a costly Russian victory was one that Western leaders would be willing to live with in private, if not in public. Russia's renewed momentum might change things, however. If Russia can advance at least to the Dnieper River, it will acquire a more defensible frontier, and if it can take Odessa, it will reduce Ukraine to a landlocked rump state. Russia's traditional geopolitical calculus and Putin's view of the world as one of civilization's states suggest that he might not stop there either. The further west Russia can go, the narrower and more easily defensible its border with NATO becomes. This was the situation the West faced in the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact satellite states had a reach stretching all the way into central Germany. The result was that the numerically superior communist forces could concentrate along a narrow border with NATO. With such strengths, the West's only realistically guaranteed approach to containing the spread of communism into Western Europe was through nuclear deterrence. The fall of the Soviet Union completely reversed this situation. Russia's goal is to get as much of the Cold War status quo back as it can. Such an outcome would pose a major threat for European security. To make matters even worse for Europe, the United States no longer regards that continent as a primary geopolitical interest. The Indo-Pacific region has become the center of global commerce and supply chains, and the rise of China as an economic and military powerhouse has greatly disrupted the traditional balance of power in that region. Preventing China from becoming a hegemon in the area has become America's primary foreign policy objective, even with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Geopolitical realities therefore ensure that America's traditional security guarantee to the European continent is not as ironclad as it once was, despite public pronouncements to the contrary. As early as the Obama administration, this became clear. President Obama famously referred to European nations as free riders in the NATO alliance and began Washington's pivot to Asia strategy. His successor, President Trump, was even more of a China hawk and had much harsher words for NATO members who fell short of spending 2% of GDP on defense. The French president took this hostility as a warning that Europe would need to be less dependent and could no longer rely on the United States for its security, years before the invasion began. Even though President Biden tried to make a show of mending fences with NATO allies, his administration has also taken an Indo-Pacific first approach to foreign policy, and the lack of American support for Ukraine since the fall of 2023 was likely one of the reasons why the French president made his recent comments. In a televised interview on March 14th, Macron reiterated that sending Western troops to Ukraine is a possibility that shouldn't be ruled out. But aside from geostrategic considerations, why should a more complete Russian victory threaten Europe so much? First, the new French Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, warned that a Russian victory would be disastrous for the purchasing power of French households because of the sharp increase in food and energy prices that it would produce. Although imports of Russian energy have declined sharply since the start of the war, the European Union was still the second largest buyer of Moscow's exports in the first half of 2023. The EU remained the largest customer for Russian liquefied natural gas in particular as the year wound down. Although France is better protected from such energy shocks thanks to its domestic nuclear energy sector, which provides over 70% of the country's power, the rest of Europe is not as secure. Germany, the continent's economic powerhouse, became more dependent on Russian energy in the years before the war, partly because it chose to shut down its nuclear power plants. Europe's food security would also be imperiled with a Russian win. Together, Russia and Ukraine exported about 26% of the world's total wheat in 2021. Although the EU's food supply would be much better protected than major importers like Egypt, Europe nevertheless imported 14.5% of its vegetable and animal oils and fats from Ukraine in 2021, along with about 10% of its oilseeds and oleaginous fruits and 6% of its total crops. Russia and Ukraine combined accounted for nearly 35% of the EU's cereal imports. Moscow securing further or complete control of these products would cause food prices in Europe to increase further. Europe is a continent already dealing with significant food inflation. As of February 2024, there is a 3% average in the EU, but this is only down from 5% total. In France, the total over the same period was 3.6%. Spain had a rate of almost 5.5%. A Russian victory would also force Europe to spend much more money on its security. After the end of the Cold War, Europe could afford to be much more lax on its defense spending and divert more money to other priorities. Under the sway of the Pax Americana at its height, and with Russia's strategic retreat behind poorly defensible borders, Europe saw an end to the age of confrontation that had held in one form or another since the build-up to World War I. However, current geopolitical realities have forced Europe to increase its defense spending again. In 2017, only 4 NATO countries were meeting NATO's guideline to spend 2% of GDP on defense. In 2021, 10 countries were meeting that target. It was a sign of the times. In early 2023, Macron called the invasion the end of the peace dividend that had come with the fall of the Soviet Union. As a result, even more NATO countries pledged to spend at least 2% on defense, including France, Germany, and Italy. Poland spent even more, to the point that it's now the largest per capita defense spender in NATO, with about 4% of the country's GDP allocated to the military. A significant Russian victory in Ukraine would force Europe to spend even more of its GDP on defense. The further west Russia gets and the narrower its border becomes on the European plain, the less it will need to spend on its own military, and the more Europe will. Russia would have much more defensible frontiers to concentrate its forces in. In contrast, Europe would need to spend elevated amounts of money to maintain readiness in its armed forces and to fortify its much harder to defend frontier against a concentrated Russian military. The states of Eastern Europe, like Poland, would be under particular threat, and such a threat would elevate the risk of creating a wider war between NATO and Russia. Although Russia would not have the vast numerical superiority it had in the Cold War, Europe would nevertheless be stuck in a much more vulnerable position, and the further west Russia can go in Ukraine, the worse that position will be. The additional money spent on security would mean that European countries would necessarily spend less on domestic programs, which in turn could increase internal political controversy, and this could be another way for Russia to undermine the West. Through financial difficulty and unprecedented waves of migration, Europe's traditional politics have become disrupted. A Russian victory would give Moscow further opportunity to sow discord through price increases and new rounds of military spending, taking money away from civilian programs. Macron anticipated this at the end of February, when he said that Russia was clearly affecting our own safety and security through both traditional and hybrid war. The latter was a reference to Moscow's grey zone operations. The West has thus far proven united in the face of the invasion, but a Russian victory would undermine this unity. Macron also mentioned that Europe's credibility was on the line. It's dedicated a significant amount of material, morale, and diplomatic support to the Ukrainians. Aside from the acute security considerations, the longer-term reason for European aid to Ukraine is to ensure that the post-World War II international norms are maintained. With the end of the Second World War and establishment of the United Nations, conceptions of international law changed. War was made illegal by Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter, which states, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purpose of the United Nations." As such, war is prohibited as a means of settling international disputes and is only permissible in self-defense or with the approval of the UN Security Council. This is part of the UN's enshrinement of the notions of the right of every state, big or small, to sovereignty and territorial integrity. These are fundamental notions to modern international law. However, as we know by now, Vladimir Putin views these notions as historical views of international relations imposed by the West through international institutions that favor Western interests. The civilization state model is his view of the world. At the start of his July 2021 essay entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin lamented that a wall had gone up between Russia and Ukraine, which were essentially the same historical and spiritual space. To Putin, the presence of large amounts of ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking people, and according to him, shared cultural traditions, is more important than these Western notions of sovereignty and territorial integrity. In effect, he considered the border an artificial separation of a shared cultural tradition. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz anticipated this clash between Western and Russian notions of international relations that the invasion would bring up. 3 days after the war started, he addressed the German Bundestag in what came to be called his Zeitenwende, turning point speech. After saying that the invasion was an unjustifiable violation of international law, he called the moment a watershed era with high stakes. The issue at the heart of this is whether power is allowed to prevail over the law, whether we permit Putin to turn back the clock to the 19th century and the age of the great powers, or whether we have it in us to keep warmongers like Putin in check. The German Chancellor further declared that Putin's true intention was to go far beyond Ukraine and redefine the status quo in Europe in line with his own vision, by force if necessary. His quest was to create a new Russian empire. In responding to the invasion with large amounts of military aid, Europe has committed to upholding the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. A significant Russian victory in Ukraine would undermine those principles and demonstrate that the use of force to acquire more territory and resources is still a valid method of statecraft. This is what Scholz meant when he warned about Putin's attempt to turn the clock back to the age of the great powers. For centuries, the great powers of Europe and the rest of the world used force as a method of changing the international status quo, acquiring new territories, and in the case of more successful states, large empires. The principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity began with the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, earning greater recognition in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and finally evolving into the UN Charter, was supposed to close the book on those earlier notions. However, Putin challenged them in a way not seen since World War II with his invasion. A victory in Ukraine, in the face of Western powers, would likely give other nations, most notably Russia's strategic partner China, an incentive to also violate post-World War II international norms. Like Russia, China under Xi Jinping is an authoritarian power that has little regard for the current international status quo. Like Putin, Xi also believes that notions of sovereignty and territorial integrity are historical impositions of Western norms that have little precedent for a different civilization, like China. Despite ideological similarities and a reportedly good personal relationship, Xi has still been reluctant to provide military aid to Russia in the war for fear of Western sanctions. A Russian victory, however, would almost certainly give Xi and other like-minded leaders the idea that they need not abide by the post-World War II standards of international behavior either, and become far more aggressive in their respective foreign policies. The danger to Taiwan and nations that China has disputes with in the South China Sea is obvious. This is the larger reason why Macron mentioned that Europe's credibility is at stake. Failure to uphold the accepted international status quo on its own continent will mean that it will be hard-pressed to champion it around the world and keep other powers like China in check. In an age where many leaders around the world believe that Western dominance is ending, a Russian victory would be a powerful psychological reinforcement. In short, Russia's invasion of Ukraine forced Europe to deal with issues that it had hoped were put to rest forever with the fall of the Soviet Union. For its immediate political, geopolitical, and economic security, and for the longer-term conduct of international relations it wishes the world to abide by, Europe cannot permit Russia to come out of the war with a substantial victory. It's unclear if the continent will accept the risks the President of France sees as acceptable to ensure that this does not happen, however. How else might Europe be forced to respond to prevent a Russian victory in Ukraine? What other damage might be done if such a thing were to occur? Will Europe continue to tolerate more risks and break more taboos to ensure such a thing does not happen? Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments. Now go and check out why NATO can't count on the US to stop a Russian invasion, or click this other video instead. Also, remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.